Okay, so we'll talk about reverse apprenticeship, and and the reason I call it reverse apprenticeship as opposed to, say, just going and paying for education. When you go and pay for education, usually you get what you pay for, but there's also a time factor involved. Not only does it take up your time, which hopefully you can make a living doing, but a lot of times it just puts you in student loan debt, and but it takes up your time, and hopefully you'll be in a situation where you get a lot of high quality instruction in a short period of time. In reality, it doesn't always work out that way. And the other thing, of course, that happens is education these days. The colleges and trade schools are not as conscious these days as they used to be about job placement, although that's a situation that's definitely improving. For the reverse apprenticeship, the reason I still call it a type of apprenticeship is you still make money while you're doing it. And so what you need to do is get some tools together, get some references together, and find work that's just on the upper edge of what you're capable of doing. And hire people who are better than you are, even if you have to pay them more than you make yourself on the job. The trick is to make sure that your own situation remains sustainable. So, for example, I did a complete frame roof sheathing and roofing job a few days ago with somebody where the job was a little out of my league. It wasn't majorly out of my league, but it was a little bit out of my league. So I very easily found a couple of people actually who were more qualified than I was to do the job, but in both cases they were guys whose life situations had led them into a situation where they didn't have tools, they didn't have truck. One of them's not really internet capable on that stuff. Hell of a good carpenter, a roofer, a good worker. He's not a guy who's going to be able to hustle the jobs. And it was a guy who had something posted on Craigslist gigs. I responded to his ad and got the job. Well, whichever guy was going to work with me on the job, it was going to be the same basic thing. And I had enough money and had enough tools that I could provide the tools and equipment for the job, the connection for the job, and I really needed their expertise. And functionally, because I was covering expenses on the job, I was going to make it where they probably walk away with a little more money than I do in that. Now, what I end up doing, though, is I end up having the tools, which means the next time the job comes around, they know to call me because I'm the missing link on what gets it done. And from the client standpoint, what they want is to get things done. Okay, that's basically how it works. Then a reverse apprenticeship, it means that I get a hold of some people who hopefully are better at various tasks than I am. And I make sure they're part of the job. And usually what happens is, especially in this economy, a lot of those guys had not made all of the best decisions on personal finance and independence they could have been making all along. Other times they've just had worse luck. And you get a hold of those people pretty easily through Craigslist gigs, networking, some forums. Here in Portland, you post a job on Craigslist gigs, you're going to get about 20 responses an hour. And what helps is to be very honest about the situation. Hey, I got a hold of a job. I've got tools and equipment. I'd really like to find somebody who's even better at this than I am. And I'll pay well. But I make sure I'm getting paid too. Okay? And since I'm kind of in charge of making sure that I get paid, okay, I'm not going to be in a traditional apprentice situation where somebody else is in control of the entire situation and I'm just kind of there at their feet begging for my little crumb. Okay, I'll be the guy who makes the determination on who gets up what situation, because I'm putting it together. And although I may not technically be the guy in charge, and that has to do with the way you need to structure things if you're, for example, not a licensed contractor. But I expect to be, my contractor's license to be coming through pretty soon, and had some talks with those people, you know, on an understanding that if all I'm doing is referring people to other people I've worked with through the temp agency or Craigslist or whatever, but I can make recommendations on people that I've worked with, and it's very important to understand the difference between working with somebody, working for somebody, or somebody working for you. I'm quite often not the boss. I'm just a coordinator. I'm not trying to be the bossy boss. I'm not trying to say that I'm the best guy there, but I will call it as I see it if somebody fucks something up or doesn't show up or something like that. And you have to have enough integrity to understand where your role is on that if you're doing a reverse apprenticeship. Because in that sense, when you have enough say in who gets to be there and who's not there, what you want to do is gravitate toward people who are a little more skilled at the given task than you are, probably a little more better worker, but that you know, are also willing to kind of slow down and show you a few things here and there, so that one, you'll be in a better position to guide or command or run other jobs with similar stuff going on, because you'll have a better idea what's going on. And that's kind of like how officer training works, generally speaking. You know, officers don't necessarily have to be the very best at every single task, but you need to be good enough at it that they can recognize who's probably doing a pretty good job and who's not. So in that sense, in a reverse apprenticeship, you're doing that, but you're getting into more detail. And you're making sure that you're the guy who is taking responsibility for getting the tools and getting the jobs and getting the right people on the right jobs. And you hang out long enough and do enough of the physical work yourself that you're picking up those skills. And one of the problems that a lot of guys run into, especially if they're downwardly social mobile for various reasons, is they got into that situation where they're coordinating the work, they've got the tools, they are kind of the primary conduit for the money and the work, and then they're not doing any of the work, and they're not really paying attention to how it's done, and in that sense, they may not be picking up all of the skills. And that's the difference between going into a career progression, let's say as a site manager or a boss, versus the reverse apprenticeship, where you are stepping in to do more hands-on. And in a reverse apprenticeship, you are almost in charge of hiring, but you're going to work with these people to learn what they do. And I've had some people propose reverse apprenticing with me on some very specific things that I do. One of them is the solar stuff, which you'll see in a lot of my videos. Another thing is with some of the IKEA assembly and installation, especially with some of their kitchens. I don't have a problem teaching somebody how it's done as long as I'm getting paid my hourly rate. A lot of other guys are going to be like, no, that's a trade secret. We can't show you any of that. So in a reverse apprenticeship, yeah, you hire people who are better than you are at stuff, because they're probably looking for work, and you cloud source that. You go on the internet for that, okay? And you are there. You have a right to be there at the job site watching things. And, you know, during the initial talking process with somebody, say, listen, I'm not totally up to speed with this and this or that, but I really want to learn it. You know, as we're working, I'm going to function more as a helper. You're going to function as the main guy, but I'm providing the tools and getting the job going. That's a normal and appropriate thing. Although, in a lot of more formal work situations, There are contractors that don't want to go for that in their relationship with the homeowner because it's, excuse me, because it's not always entirely clear whose insurance is covering that. And in those types of situations, you do want to be aware of your need to be risk adverse, because in a reverse apprenticeship, you're probably not going to be in a position to be able to absorb any losses from an accepted risk where something went wrong. Well, you know, if something goes wrong, you're not in a position to be able to absorb those losses. If you're going through a traditional school or apprenticeship and something goes wrong, well, it's the other guy's fault because the other guy was in charge, or I was just a student, or I was just the junior guy on the job, and somebody else is in charge and it was their thing and it was not my doing, not my fault. And that is one of the situations that you're not eligible to play that card in reverse apprenticeship situations. So a reverse apprenticeship has to be approached with a little bit more maturity, because technically you may be considered a person who is in charge if something goes wrong. And on that, it's a little bit of a nuance between what we call leadership based on expertise or leadership based on situation. And that's where everybody kind of has to be you really got to be an adult about it. And it sometimes, let's say for example in the military, somebody who's really in a military hierarchical situation or mindset, I'm sorry, they're of a military hierarchical mindset, but the situation in a reverse apprenticeship is it's a little bit cloudier than you know, a straight up hierarchical apprenticeship where the master is the guy in charge, because in this situation, master's not a guy in charge. The master is somebody you've hired. You're providing a lot of resources. Obviously you want to respect the people involved, but you also don't want them getting over on you. So that's, in a nutshell, a reverse apprenticeship is where you hire people who are better than you are at various tasks. You may, in the net, be paying them more than you get to keep yourself, but that's mainly because you're covering expenses, and they're not. They're mainly just going to walk away with their pay, and that's that. You may be walking away with less money left over after the job, but you're not necessarily walking away with nothing. You're walking away with at least enough to have made a basic living at what you were doing, which is different from going to school where you make absolutely nothing and you're just paying money, or a traditional apprenticeship where you're also walking away with less money, but you're also dependent the entire time. In a reverse apprenticeship, you are not the dependent. The master is actually the dependent on that situation. But in that model, in that organizational model for employment, especially if you're breaking out of a bad situation or opportunities were not made available to you through traditional means, and I would say very clearly, the temp agencies quite often are a dead end thing. They're not going. You're not going to get ahead that way very often. Only a small percentage of people are actually going to succeed through that environment. So on to the next video.